Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The 2020 Extraordinary Lives Virtual Conference is in partnership with Gigi's Playhouse Nashville, Clarksville Association on Down Syndrome, the Down Syndrome Awareness Group of East Tennessee, Friends Tri-Cities, and made possible in part by grants provided by Global Down Syndrome Foundation and the Tennessee Council on Developmental Disabilities. In order to ensure we're meeting the requirements of our grants, I would like to ask that you please take the time to complete the survey at the end of the webinar. Also, please be forgiving this session. If there happens to be any technical difficulties, this is our first webinar. Let me introduce our presenter for today for Down Syndrome Learning Styles. Alecia Talbott became the Executive Director of DSAMT in 2012. After spending several years as an active member and volunteer in our organization and in the disability community, she received her BA and MA from Western Kentucky University and taught at Nashville State and volunteer community colleges, and was in marketing before joining DSAMT. She's a strong advocate for inclusion and acceptance for those with Down syndrome and other disabilities in the community and schools, having completed the Vanderbilt Volunteer Advocacy Program, Rights Law training, and other advocacy trainings. Her passion lies in helping those with Down syndrome show the world that those with something extra bring extraordinary gifts to our communities that should be recognized and valued. She also has Ron, which is the most important thing, who is 11 years old. Alecia Talbott.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. I'm not accustomed to doing webinars like this where I can't see everybody, so bear with me. Do note that there is the option to ask questions as we go along, and Tanya will let me know when we have those. I think there's an option there on the right of your screen to do that. So if you have questions, when they pop in your mind, go ahead and type those in, and she can either interrupt me or we can answer those at the end. But I certainly am available for lots of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Tanya, you're going to make me the presenter.
You should be on.
I don't have that button now. Sorry, guys. We practiced this literally 1 minute ago and it worked fine.
Sorry about that.
There we go. That's okay. All right, is my screen up? Is my screen up, Tanya?
Yes,
okay,
it is.
Perfect. Sorry about that. So here we go. We're talking today about learning styles and strategies for learners with Down syndrome. Of course, everything we talk about today would also apply to other children, adults, or students who have similar learning styles. For those of you who don't know me, that little Boy Scout down there in the bottom left-hand corner is my son from a couple of years ago. That's Ron, and you'll probably see a couple of pictures of him in this as we go through. So I wanted to keep this fairly short and get right into the meat of the learning strategies, learning styles, so that you can walk away with some new tools in your toolbox, hopefully, or a review for some of you who may have teenagers or adults. So we're gonna start in right with what the common strengths and weaknesses are that are common among those with Down syndrome. What are those typical learning styles for children and adults with Down syndrome, and then specifically, what can you do to help your child learn, which I think is very important, especially right now. Getting used to changing this screen. So my first slide here, so you know one person with Down syndrome, and my response is congratulations, you know one person with Down syndrome. And that's important to keep in mind throughout this presentation or any other resource that you might turn to regarding how to help individuals with Down syndrome and what their strengths or strategies are that will help. Just because it works with one child doesn't mean it will work with another. And just because it works with your child when they're 10 doesn't mean that same strategy will be effective when they are 33. So everybody is unique and different, as you know, and we just need to keep that in mind. The other main point I want to make is that learning is a lifelong process. So it begins right away and it continues for individuals with Down syndrome throughout the lifespan. So if your child is, 16, don't accept that, quote, they won't ever read if they're not yet reading. There is plenty of time to learn things. And as we all know, the process of learning is affected by a number of different things, not just one's cognitive ability, which is, I think, what most people think of when they're thinking about educating someone with Down syndrome or teaching someone with Down syndrome a new skill. But there's the environment, psychological factors, how if the child is in a good mood or not. I know it's a lot easier for me to read or to learn something if I'm in a good mood and I'm well rested. So those things play a role. What methods of teaching are available or are used will affect the learning process. What one's expectations are, both of yourself and that other people have of you. And of course, individual strengths and weaknesses, which is why I want to start and talk about some of those strengths and weaknesses. So we'll start with common challenges. And I actually really like this graphic because everybody's kind of at a different point. And it also brings home the fact that, again, we're all climbing ladders. They may have different size spokes. They may have different points, but we're all trying to access, basically happiness and independence in life and a meaningful experience. So some possible challenges that our students or our children with Down syndrome face that will affect their learning. Hearing loss, of course, is very common among individuals with Down syndrome. Their expressive language is often very difficult, which ties in partly with articulation, but the other part of that is just getting the actual words out, of course. If your parents in the room, I'm sure you've experienced, just my child sometimes wants a pretzel and all he says is pretzel. I don't always get a complete sentence, so that expression of language can be a challenge. Of course, we know because of the palate differences, articulation can be difficult. Auditory processing is particularly difficult. So if you were just sitting and listening to this presentation or like a podcast, I'm not an auditory processor, so podcasts are not my thing. It's very difficult for me to stay focused in that. But our kids have trouble if they're only being asked to listen without other additional supports. And of course, short-term memory plays a role too. We know that our children and adults have some deficits generally in short-term and working memory. And all of those factors can play into how they're learning and how they'll learn best. So some challenges in socialization, which we know is also part of learning, and whether that's at home or at school, it comes into place. It's pretty common to see individuals with Down syndrome to avoiding a task sometimes, particularly if that task looks difficult or seems overwhelming. Our children are also affected by learned helplessness. I tell the story every time. My son has a best friend who wears orthotics. And this child is 4 years older than my son. And he comes over to play, and the boys decide they want to go outside. And so I say, yes, we'll go outside, but first put your shoes on. And my son will run and put his shoes on. And the other child kind of sits and waits. And he has learned that if he does that, Ron will go and get his orthotics and his shoes and put them both on the other boy's feet. And so he doesn't have to put on his own shoes and orthotics. And all because Ron did it one time and we made a big deal about how kind of cute that was. He can totally put on his own orthotics and shoes, but the fact that my son will do it for him means he always waits. So we have to kind of intervene. But that's what that learned helplessness is. When you get accustomed to somebody doing something for you before you have that chance to struggle through it the first time. And it's pretty common. You see it in kids and adults. And the other issue that comes into place from learning is sensitivity to failure. Our kids want, and I'm going to use the term kid very broadly because I'm old enough to be the parent of most of our kids who are on the call, I imagine, today. But I don't mean that as if our children are young. Again, it could be any age, but so our kids are generally very sensitive to failure. And that plays a role. And if you've ever had a job and somebody asked you to do something and you thought it would be really hard and you weren't sure if you could accomplish it, you can imagine how that affects the work that you do. And so we see this high sensitivity. And again, that'll play into the avoiding of task completion a lot, or even getting started in a task. This is Will McMillan, by the way, in the picture, one of our self-advocates of the year. I just adore this picture. So some challenges in learning and memory, because we know those are impacting learning for our kids. One of those is, again, the short-term and working memory. And think about it, if you're at least 40, you've had one of those days where you leave the kitchen and you go in the living room to get something, and by the time you get in there, you've completely forgotten why you went in there, and how frustrating that is. So that's a short-term working memory kind of issue, and our kids are much more likely to experience that. So you can imagine how that affects learning. Focus can be difficult. Generalization can be a challenge, and that's where you'll see a child learn one skill in one classroom, or maybe at home he will take his plate up off the dinner table and put it in the sink and put his dishes away, but at grandma's house it doesn't even occur to him to do that. It's that generalization of one skill from one environment to another environment, or even within a similar environment. Abstract numbers and concepts, those are very difficult for our kids. So we'll find that math is often much more difficult than learning to read, because you have to think about it for a minute. Math is, numbers are abstract. A 3 can be 3 bears, it can be 3 bananas, it can be THREE. So it's very abstract, where I know a banana is a banana is a banana. The learning and memory issues make it difficult to plan. So in thinking ahead, I know if I say to my son, do you want to go to Jonathan's house? The only thing he thinks is Jonathan's house. He's not planning, although sometimes he plans and goes and packs a bag full of toys and underwear and shorts for a month. But generally planning out what would be needed for a short play date, and planning out what will happen after that can be very difficult. So being able to plan, 4 or 5 steps to accomplish something can be very difficult. Organizing, again, falls under planning. So it's important that we teach them matching and scheduling and those type things. And transitions can also be difficult. And I like to think of this as, if you have a job and you know you're going to have lunch, but you have no idea what time lunch is, that can be very frustrating. And so for an abstract concept like time, transition can really be difficult. You don't know when, you're probably filled with a little anxiety, it will be harder to focus during that time period. And so we see with a lot of our children, going from one task to another becoming difficult. And not just tasks like school tasks, but going from a preferred activity like playing video games to let's do math homework now. That kind of transition can also be very difficult. Okay, so for all the women on the call, this picture's for you. I was looking for a good strength picture today, and I thought this would be funny. So those are kind of the weaknesses, and I think it's important to just kind of refresh what those are, because they will influence the strategies. The strengths are even more important, in my opinion, because we want to use those strengths to overcome any of those weaknesses. So strengths in communication, of course, receptive language. Anybody with a child with Down syndrome in general will say, my child understands more than they can communicate. And the communication is the expressive language, the receptive is the understanding. Sign language is really great for our kids because there's a visual component and a physical component of using your hands as part of that. So that's often a strength for our kids. Nonverbal communication and social cues, generally speaking, a child with Down syndrome is pretty aware of what facial expressions are, what they mean. Although there are some that can be tricky for some of our kids, but they generally understand if the atmosphere is tense or if somebody else is in trouble. I know my son knows every time that my daughter is in trouble. And he especially knows if somebody else is hurt. He seems to pay very close attention to that. So they can pick up on that. And these are strengths that we want to be able to leverage in how we're teaching them. So they also have quite a few strengths in socialization in general. And again, let me back up and say, remember, one kid with Down syndrome, one kid with Down syndrome. That's great. They are as unique as you or I. So as we talk about these weaknesses and strengths, remember, they don't all apply to every child with Down syndrome. Different pieces will apply to different children. And all of these strengths or weaknesses can certainly happen in any child with or without Down syndrome. So their strengths for socialization, generally empathy. Again, they pick up on those social cues. So they're able to understand, hey, you're hurting. I know what that means. And let's have a hug, or, let's get you a Band-Aid. Generally, overall socialization is very good. Our kids generally make friends pretty easily. There's actually quite a bit of research that backs up even just the physical appearance. The faces of our children with Down syndrome are seen as being very cute and happy and positive, which certainly contributes to some of that positive socialization, ease of making friends, if they have a physical look that is disarming. Social understanding, nonverbal communication. My son knows what I mean when I poke my finger. I'm sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Imitation. One of the things that is strong in a lot of our kids is imitating others, which can be a huge strength, particularly if you have older siblings or same age siblings, even younger siblings, of course, but also in school environments when you can pair them with a neurotypical child as a peer or a peer buddy. A lot of times our kids will imitate. Even in the learning, it's part of the child development process to begin with, but our children will a lot of times continue to imitate other people, for good or bad, throughout the lifespan. So strengths in learning and memory that will affect their learning. They're going to be visual versus verbal. So again, having the visual reminders will be much more effective than simply telling them what to do, or a visual prompt versus a verbal prompt. I like to think of it that way sometimes. Rhythmic and musical processing, this is great. It's a terrible thing to say. I've never met a person with Down syndrome who didn't like music, but it's a great way to encourage learning and remember things. I still know that 6 times 9 is 54. And all of my 6 times 9s, because when we were in 4th grade, you didn't learn multiplication until 4th grade then, and we did multiplication, there were records, and each record for the multiplication was set to a different music style. And I will always remember that. And I remember that 6 times 9 is 54 because that was the bluegrass country version. And that was a particularly funny part of the song. So that anytime that music can be incorporated, it's going to be helpful. Of course, reading, again, is going to be visual versus just the oral language. Communication is generally pretty strong in our children. They can communicate, and they will communicate if the expectation is there. They may need some alternative ways to support that communication, so it may not all be verbal, but our kids have a way of communicating. And they tend to be persistent about that. And you have to think about the fact that all behavior is a communication. So our kids are going to let us know what they're feeling and needing and wanting, generally speaking. And again, imitation is great to help with memory too. Okay, so those are kind of, I always want to start with the weaknesses and the strengths. the plan before we talk about the real strategies, because this is really the meat and the most important part. But those weaknesses and strengths play in very importantly. And the most important thing I want to say, and I talk about this with parents and teachers all the time, is think about setting your child up for success. You know, before I had children with disabilities, it never occurred, you know, I would take my nieces somewhere. I would say, hey, do you want to go get ice cream? And I never planned in advance what that trip would look like. We just got up, grabbed the purse, grabbed the keys, got in the car, told everybody to put their seatbelt on, and off we drove. We went in, everybody ordered, I paid, we sat down and had ice cream. But when you have a child with disabilities, you really want to think about, will they be successful in that trip? I can tell you my child will not be successful in that trip unless I have well planned it out. One of the better examples I have of avoiding situations that set the child up for failure, when my daughter was younger, one of her primary diagnoses has been pretty severe ADHD. And it was the day for the class to take the class picture. That's not the one where you get up and take your picture by yourself, but the picture of the entire class, where they get up on the bleachers and they all have to stand there, and you've got 25 or 30 kids and a teacher. Generally, this is not a quick picture. Getting 30 kids to do anything in third grade at the same time is extremely difficult, I imagine. This is why I'm not an elementary school teacher. But for this particular day, no one thought ahead. And so I got a phone call, and they said, we had a problem today at picture day. Your daughter wouldn't stand still. And then, you know, after about 5 minutes, she was poking people and talking, and then somebody got pushed and, you know, the kids fell down. And so it was this big disaster. And my first question to the school was, what did you do to set her up for success? And that is, you have a child with severe ADHD who has in her IEP that she needs regular breaks throughout the day. In fact, at the time, I think there were at least 2 every hour breaks that she would have. And she had break cards, so she could ask for her own break. But nobody thought about how difficult standing in the bleachers would be for a period of time in advance. And I, you know, afterwards, I thought of 3 or 4 different ways that this could have potentially been avoided. It's not 100%, but they could have. You know, I said she loves to draw, so she could have had a piece of paper and a pencil and been drawing while everybody else gets lined up, and then my kid could have been put in the very last minute after you've gotten most everybody else straightened up, so that she wouldn't have to stand there quiet, not talking, not moving. It could have been a reward system. You know, we're going to ask you to stand there and do something very difficult, which is to stand still and be quiet for 15 minutes. This was not a skill that she would have been able to do without a lot of support. Like, I'm going to be waving at you, and every time I wave, I'm going to put a sticker on this board. And if you get 10 stickers, you get 5 extra minutes of recess, or whatever that would be. So I just think, you know, before you get ready to do something, it's always important to think, how can we make this child successful? Will they be successful with this? If we don't think they'll be successful, what can we do to support that? So leveraging student strengths is why it's so important. Take a look at what your child's strengths are. What are they? My son, for example, is a huge imitator. So if I can get another kid to do what I want my kid to do, and have them do it first, my kid's probably going to do that. Again, for better or for worse. So figure out what those strengths are. Help them show you what they know, but let them try first. And this is a really big key. We know that a lot of individuals with Down syndrome or other disabilities will tell you when they need help, but they really resent not being given the opportunity to try it first. And as a parent, I can tell you sometimes that's very hard to just step back and watch him make that bowl of cereal, because half of the Rice Krispies end up on the floor and half of the milk ends up on the table dripping down the floor. And that can be very difficult. But I have to do that sometimes because it's teaching him to be independent. And then we can also practice the skill of cleaning up afterwards. But it gives him some independence. And sometimes you just have to step back and let that happen. Again, if you're trying to, it's intuitive to kind of jump in and do something for someone else when they're struggling. I see this with like opening up a milk carton, for example, or putting the straw in the juice box. It's so quick to go, here, let me help you, and to just do that. But you can teach one, learned helplessness in doing that, and also you're denying them that opportunity for independence and skill building, about which I'm sure they would feel very, very confident and proud. I think it's important to have realistic expectations, and that your child or your students know what those expectations are, but it's very important to keep them high. We know just historically that individuals with disabilities had low expectations, and guess what? Very, very few were rising to a higher level than what society expected of them. And very few had higher expectations for themselves. It's the same thing with you. If you think you're only going to be able to lose 5 pounds, you're probably not going to lose 20. But if you think you might lose 30 pounds, you got a pretty good shot at losing at least 10, right? So the expectation makes a big difference. Always plan ahead. And if you can't plan ahead, be prepared for what may or may not happen. I think the planning ahead part is a parent, one of the more difficult things. And even as an educator, I think it can be difficult. It doesn't have to be nearly as difficult, I think, as people might think on the front end, because sometimes it's just a simple thing. Sometimes it's a very small support that a child will need, as opposed to something, that is tremendously big. So a lot of times those supports can be put in place very easily. The other thing is to make sure that your child has the understanding of all of the concepts for what you're asking them to do before moving on to the next step. Sometimes we're not thinking when we've said, okay, do this one thing and then another. Sorry, I'm checking the notes here as people are typing in. I got to get better at this. Sometimes it's difficult to think about when you're asking a child to do something. Do they have all of the skills available to them to do all of the things it takes prior to that? So think about, if I tell my child to get ready for bed, do they understand? And do they have the organization? Do they have the memory of how many steps are involved in getting ready for bed? I know what getting ready for bed means. I've been doing it for 40 years. But does my child know that means going to the bathroom, brushing teeth, putting on pajamas, telling me at that point so we can read the story, etc.? Do they know all those steps, and can they do all those steps if it's an academic task in particular? So you got to think about, how do I make my child be successful? This is my son. This is a play area in our neighborhood park. He was very little and he went way too high. I tell people to have high expectations, and I really truly believe this. When he was in kindergarten, we modified the handwriting, right? So children with Down syndrome often have low muscle tone. Occupational therapy, fine motor skills were very difficult for him. So one of the things we did was, when the children practiced their handwriting on a worksheet, they had to write the letter A 25 times on a piece of paper. So we wanted to make that simpler for him, not look as complicated, not look as overwhelming. So we folded the paper up. So he only had to do it like the first row, like 5 times. Then he would be given a sticker as reinforcement for that. They would put that piece of paper then in a folder on the teacher's desk, and then he was given an iPad so that he could practice handwriting without tears, which is an application and a program, a training process for learning fine motor skills. But he could do that with his iPad, practicing drawing the letter A with his finger, while the other students were finishing up, writing the letter A there 25 times. And so this is what we did for a number of weeks in kindergarten. And I got a phone call from the school one day, and the teacher said, well, we had a problem today. And I'm thinking, oh no, what did my child do? Did we pull the fire alarm again? Fortunately, not this time. But what had happened was He had gone through those 5 A's, and they gave him a sticker. They put the piece of paper into the folder, put it on the teacher's desk, and give him his iPad. And he got mad, and he threw the iPad and pushed his chair back. And then he proceeded to go up to the teacher's desk, get that folder with that piece of paper in it, bring it back to his desk, unfold it, and he wrote the letter A every single time on that paper. So for me and them, it was a great example of our expectation was not high enough that he could do that. And from that point forward, we made him write the letter a lot more than 5 times. He didn't have to write the whole 25 times, but once he proved to us that he could do it, we want to maintain those high expectations and hold him to that. So he does not lose those skills, and he's able to continue to build on that. But I can't tell you how many times it's happened where my expectation of what he could do was lower. And so we always are looking at high expectations and keeping them, because then they achieve more. This is one of my favorite cartoons when it comes to educating people with Down syndrome and helping people with Down syndrome, is to help them help themselves. So when you think of help, I love this because, you know, it's very intuitive for anybody. If you see somebody who's struggling, to help. If you approach a door and there's someone in a wheelchair and it's an uphill ramp, you hold the door for him. My son, though, we can be in a grocery store and his shoe fall off, and I'm telling you, 5 people come out of the woodwork to pick up a shoe for him. And I'm like, well, he can do that all by himself. Thank you, but we don't need that help. But that learned helplessness is a big deal. And sometimes he gets mad, and others would too, of that kind of doing for you when you haven't had a chance to do it yourself. So I always think that the ultimate goal for independence and achievement is going to be helping them help themselves. So how can we do that? Here's my son again. If you have little ones, this is a Tubaloo that he's using. You tuck into one side, it goes right to your ear. It's great for language development because they hear it right away and it's very clear. But let's talk about some very specific strategies from a communication standpoint that you can use to better the educational process or help your child more. And the first one is going to be visual supports. The more you can visually support your child, the better they're going to be. Think back to the weaknesses and the strengths. They're going to be visual learners. Think about, here's the example I always use for this. I was sent directions when we moved into the office at DSAMT. We bought several pieces of furniture, all of which had to be assembled. Interestingly, one came with absolutely no directions, not written, not in pictures, of no format, and no video. Another one came and it had directions, but it had no pictures. And I very, very, very quickly got frustrated and asked someone else to put it together. And another one came and it had pictures and it had directions, and it was much easier to follow. But yet another one had a video. And so I could follow that and I could see exactly which screw they were picking up, as opposed to screw A into screw B. It was so much easier for me. So you think about it for our children who are visual learners. The more visual supports that you can provide, oftentimes the better, in terms of being able to remember things, but also to grasp the concepts. Sign language, again, is going to be a great way to get information out of our kids. I know one of the things people often say is our children can't show us as much as they know. Again, it's the expression of language and of what we know is more difficult than the understanding, than the receptive. So the sign language can help with that. Electronic communication devices. If your child is nonverbal or has a lot of trouble talking, those devices are great with the pictures, the words, and the vocalization. So they're matching all of those 3 pieces at one time, and that's falling into their strength category there. Rhyme, music, anytime you can incorporate that, it's going to help with communication. The one that I have a lot of trouble with, particularly after like I've had 5 or 6 cups of coffee like I have today, is to talk slower and allow more time for processing. The rule is 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 seconds to process a question before you say or give another prompt. And you got to remind yourself of that 10-second rule because it's difficult. It's difficult for me. It's not intuitive for me, especially in today's day and age where everything is fast, 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 fast. But I catch myself doing this all the time. If I say to my husband, "What time did you leave the office today?" and he doesn't answer in 2 seconds, I'm thinking, well, I'll continue to ask the question and I'll ask it in a different way. And I'll use different words. And I'll say, well, it's 5 o'clock now. How long does it normally take you to get here? So now I've entered in, think about this from a processing standpoint. I've entered in 2 more different variables. How long it takes to get from here to there, what time it is now. And if he still hasn't answered me, and I'll probably come up with something else to say. And at that point, he'll probably be frustrated with me. Thanks, Robin. And so that's one thing to remember is just talk slower, allow 10 seconds before you then give another prompt or ask that question again. Maintain eye contact, be at their level. That makes a big difference. Again, it's respect, it's making of the focus on another individual. I do say to reinforce all communication efforts and repeat what they've said to demonstrate that you understand. One of the best pieces of research from the communication standpoint that I have had the pleasure of being a part of, but also sharing with families is Dr. Yoder, his research from Vanderbilt on children with Down syndrome and their ability to be understood, which was something that hadn't been looked at scientifically very much. So what he found was for children who were good imitators, if and when they attempted to say something, so if Ron tried to say Coke, and he said Coke, which is pretty common, or he'd say oak. That's probably the more common, right? He would look at that and say, Mom, oak. And so my job is simply to repeat back what I think he said. I would say, Mom, Coke. And it's just repeating back. So he's hearing the correct, without my saying, no, say Coke. No, say Coke. There was no additional pressure. Eventually, what he found was that the kids imitated. And we found this to be the case here. So when I say, Mom, Coke, almost every time Ron would come back and say it closer to Mom, Coke. He would try it again. And one of the best pieces of feedback I think that I was able to give him on the study that we participated in and the subsequent findings and suggestions for parents. You can find that study, by the way, on our website under resources. But one of the best things about that was when he started using 3, 4, 5 words, and we started repeating back what we thought, the first few times when we got it correct, he was lit up with pride. It was like all the lights clicked and he said, yay, someone understands me. And after, having several years, speech was a big delay for him, having 7 or 8 years where communication was such a struggle for him, and how frustrating that must be to him, and affect his mood and patience and all of those types of things. But for him to realize that we understood, it was a big deal. So we do continue to do that. And so if a child utters something, even if it's just grr, while they're picking up a cow, you want to say cow or moo or whatever you think that appropriate vocalization would be. That's going to go a long way. But it also lets them know that you're going to talk back to them and you expect them to talk. And I think that's very important. It's not just talking vocally. If your child is using electronic communication devices, sign language, it's the same process, right? So I'm still repeating back. And we do this when kids, when they first time they sign more, the first thing we do as parents is immediately sign back and say more, yay, good. So it's just kind of continuing that process. All of those will help. Socialization wise, some will work better with peer support. Some work better with adults. You know your child and leverage, or your student and leverage whichever one of those is most appropriate. Certainly make sure the expectations are very clear with them. Practicing is going to be key, and practicing social skills through drama, role play, social stories. These are great. And if you need examples, there's a million on Pinterest. Our website actually has a couple now on the pandemic and COVID, because they're stories and they have pictures, right? And if you can practice that, that action learning is going to go far better than any verbal lesson. Reinforce appropriate behavior frequently, and I can't say this enough. A lot of people say, my kid is whatever, spitting or saying a bad word or pulling hair or hitting or not staying in his seat, whatever that is, or peeing in his pants. If you can catch that kid doing the right thing in the right behavior and praise it when you see it, it's going to go a lot further than having to correct every time they make a mistake. And it's going to, if you think back to one of the strengths that we talked about, being that empathy and that high sensitivity, they're going to perform a lot better if they're being positively rewarded and praised when they're doing good things, as opposed to always hearing what you do wrong. So that makes a difference. So you want to make sure and plan for appropriately or reinforcing appropriate behaviors or activities. And I'll say this, the best example I have of that really being effective with us was over the seat belt. So we went through a period when Ron got out of the 5-point harness and we used the regular seat belt. And he knew he could undo that. And I was too afraid to put on any kind of lock where he couldn't get out of that in the event of a wreck or a fire or something. And so we would be driving down the interstate coming home from preschool, and he would unpop that thing and it would terrify me. And so we had, appropriate behavior things in place. But one of the things that we started doing was, as soon as we got in the car and we put that seatbelt on, we turned around and gave big high fives. You're wearing your seatbelt. I'm wearing my seatbelt too. You're doing a great job. And then about every 5 minutes on the road, I'd say, look, you're still wearing your seatbelt. Great job. And that was a lot more effective for us in getting him to keep that on long term than it was to pull over and go through the whole 9 yards about, you have to keep your seatbelt on, you have to keep your seatbelt on, don't take it off, and all of that, particularly on the interstate. So that was a great just frequency of repeating that reinforcement. And then over time, of course, you always want to have a plan to slow that down. So instead of every 5 minutes saying, hey, you got your seatbelt on, what a great job you're doing, we take that to 7 minutes. And maybe then on a ride, we only do it twice. And now eventually I don't ever have to say that. Particularly if you're an educator, be aware of preferential seating or arrangement of where you put the children. If you want positive socialization, you want positive learning, you want positive behavior, and you have somebody who's susceptible, particularly if they're an imitator, if they play off other kids, don't put them by the other child in your classroom who has attention issues or who is always, meddling, getting in the box of crayons or pushing over on their space and all that kind of stuff. Find that positive role model so that they are able to model that appropriate behavior and appropriate response. And again, it's a visual representation of what I should be doing. Okay, some general learning strategies. These are just some things that I've picked up and talked to teachers about and that we've also used. I'm sure most of you do first then. And if you have a little kid and you haven't done that yet, welcome to the life of first then. So and basically that's pairing a non-preferred task to a preferred task. So we say, first wash hands, which we're not real fond of doing, and then you can have snack. Or if you follow me on Facebook, first put on your underwear and then you can watch TV. So first you do your math and then we can go listen to music or whatever that would be. It lets them know, again, planning being difficult, it lets them know, oh, if I do this, there is something coming up next, and that something coming up next is something I want. And so you can create some great visual supports for first then. Pinterest has a bunch, but you can also get some probably from your speech therapist if you have one. And if not, you can take a piece of paper. We've done these on the spot in the doctor's office. First, sit in the chair, or first we see the doctor, and then we get a lollipop. It's that simple. You can just write the words, or you can write 1 and then 2, whichever works better for your kid. And you can draw simple pictures if you're on the, out and about somewhere and need to do something like that. But it's the same thing. Anything you're trying to teach them. First, we're going to practice tying your shoe, and then you can go outside and play. The other key is going to be providing multiple ways for them to show you what they know. We know it's hard for them to show us some ways. And so if I say to a child who has Down syndrome and they're in first or second grade, and I say, tell me the alphabet, that's hard. That's all expressive. It also is playing off my memory issue. Could also be hearing, speech, all of the weaknesses, think about, that would play into that. However, and I have parents who say, I know my child knows all the letters of the alphabet, but school says he doesn't, or vice versa. This is sometimes as simple as providing different ways for them to answer and different ways for them to show you what they know. My son knows pretty much what letter every Halloween thing starts with. He knows that ghost starts with a G and pumpkin starts with a P. But that's because we showed him those things and let him pick out which one starts with the letter P. So that was pointing, or show us the letter P and you give them a choice. The other thing you can do is match the 2 pumpkins, or the 2 words of pumpkin. Here's the number 2 and the word 2, match those together. Or just show me which one. Again, visuals play into this, which is why the point, match, and select are way more effective, and certainly are easier for our kids to understand than just saying, count to 100 for me, or just tell me the alphabet. Using simple language with few words. This is the other one that I always think about when I think about that 10-second rule. One of the best lessons that I ever got from ABA therapists were quit talking so much with my kids and explaining so much. Keep it simple, stupid. It's important because the more words you use, the more there is to process, the more there is to think about, the more there is to have to remember. So using simple language, a few words. And when he was real little, it would be as simple as eat. Think about when you taught your children sign language. You taught them eat, you taught them more, you taught them milk, please, right? And those were 1 words. It wasn't, thank you for the milk you just gave me, Mom. You just taught them thank you. And so keeping it simple, particularly when you're learning something new, is going to be important. For those of you who are teaching at home during this time period, this is a great trick. And a lot of the reading curriculums that I've seen, I know the DSA, the See and Learn uses this method, and a lot of educators do as well. But this is errorless learning. So a lot of children with Down syndrome will be very sensitive. They don't often want to complete things that look difficult or that they might fail on. And you have to kind of think about, if things are already hard and I'm getting things wrong, and you're marking everyone that's wrong, or you're saying, no, that's not right, and you're making me do it again at that moment, that's a lot less fun. My mom taught me to sew, and she would do that. She'd want to rip out every square if I made one mistake. But she got to the point where she would just say, it's okay, you just keep moving. And I started to enjoy it a lot more. It's the exact same process. And this is just where, if I have 5 sight words, This is hard to do without being physically there in front of people, but if I have 5 sight words on cards, and let's just use animals as an example. And the first card is dog, and the second is cat, and the third is elephant, and the fourth is bug. I put the first card down in front of my child. And maybe I'm asking them to read it, or maybe I'm asking it to match. Either way, however I'm doing it is fine. But the first one, what I say was dog, and they say dog, or they sign dog, and we say, yeah, you got that right. And I put that in a stack. And the next one is cat. And she looks at the card and she says cat, or signs cat. And I go, yeah, you got that one right. And we put that in a stack. The next one is elephant. And she looks at me and says bird. I'm just going to pick up that card and I'm going to set it down. And I'm going to move on. There's going to be no production. It's not going to be, no, you got that wrong, try again. It's not going to be, let's figure this out together. We're just going to move it to the side. And at the end of this, we'll have cards that we know and some cards we don't know. And so the next time, obviously, we're going to want to work on the cards we don't know. So we're going to take some of those cards that we know that we already knew, and then some of the cards that we don't know. And we're going to start with the ones we know, right? So we're going to start out with the easy stuff. We're going to be very positive about that. And we're going to do dog again, and we're going to do cat again. And we're going to do elephant again. And if she gets elephant right, we're going to cheer yay, and we're going to make a big deal about that. And then elephant stays in the mastered pile for the next time. But if she doesn't, again, we're just going to put that one to the side. It's just like, I don't know if there's any dads on here, but it's just like with your husband. If they put the dishes away and they put them in the wrong spot, and I make a big production about the fact that the knives go in this little spot and the spoons go in this spot, he's much less happy about putting the dishes away the next time I ask him to do that. If I just say thanks and I move those things on my own, he's likely to do it again. And in some other instance, I can point out where the knives actually go. But it's part of it is psychological, part of it is confidence, and part of it is just, it's always more fun when you're getting things right, isn't it? It is in my world. So airless learning is great. High probability momentum. I love this one. And I don't remember if it was an ABA therapist who taught me this, or I got this somewhere else, but this is just, you get them doing something that they like, that they enjoy, and you just keep building on that. So if you want, it's often used like for transitions. So and we've done it for bedtime. So I'll say, hey, give me a high five. Kids love it. If your child loves a high five, give me a high five. Yay. I got compliance very quickly. They did exactly what I asked them to do. The second thing I might say, give me 2 high fives, right? And then I'm going to keep going fast, and I'm going to build this momentum. Give me a hug, give me a kiss, give me a woo-hoo-hoo. And we used to parade to the bedroom that way. If I had said, go to bed, we would not be parading to the bedroom. But because what we did was we built up probability that we would keep going. So we did these things that he enjoyed and were fun and built up his confidence and got him going. And then we would suddenly be in the bedroom. And then we would always do, something fun once we were there to reinforce that. But that's just that concept of taking small steps, positive steps, happy steps, get everybody in the right frame of mind, focus on going towards a goal. Just like as you learn to run a marathon, you do those little ones and you eventually get there. So that's a great trick. And then of course, positive role models when and if ever possible. Ron's trying to learn to use the CPAP, and I know that if his friend would come over and put his CPAP on, Ron would be much more likely to do that. So we're going to give that a try at some point. Oh, I went backwards. So those are just, and those would be across, of course, learning strategies that you can use anywhere, at home, at school, and you can use those with any children. Most of them are also good tricks to use on husbands. So other things to be aware of is the environment. Is that really next? Yeah, okay. So be aware of the environment in which learning is happening as well, because everything from, Remember, our kids can have trouble focusing. Short-term memory can be difficult, but too many visual supports can be distracting if they're all right around. And if you're home and you're trying to school and you have this great setup on the kitchen table or the office table that's got all this cool manipulatives on it, that would never work for me because my child would be so distracted so quickly. We had to go where there was a plain table and there was nothing else around, and it was pouring and the toys were all put away. So that plays in. Is the environment engaging? Is it somewhere he likes to be? Are you close enough proximity wise so that you encourage the focus on whatever learning you're trying to accomplish? Are my sensory needs met? I think that's something we don't often think about, but sometimes children have a hard time just sitting still, and there are ways to support those things. And so, if your kid has trouble sitting still, get them something to hold on to while they're doing that. I actually talked to the behavior therapist this morning about the CPAP that we're trying to get my son to wear. And so one of the rewards he'll have when he practices is to watch TV. And she said, but what will he have to do while he's got that on? Is the TV enough of a focus for him, or does he need to have that toy at the same time? So some of that can just be sensory. And are they visually supported in the environment? I always think about that because our kids are such visual learners. And sometimes we forget because we can learn in so many different ways, and we're not often thinking about the visuals. And it's something that's really important. A lot of times you'll see some problem behavior or lack of compliance because we haven't thought about visual supports. We've done this at the doctor's office where we're having trouble just staying in the room, and all of a sudden we bring in a visual schedule that says it's got a picture of the doctor, and it says first we're going to see the doctor, and then you're going to get a snack, or then you get to ride in the elevator, which at my house is a really big deal if you get to ride in the elevator anywhere. So that visual, even though we had already told him we're going to the doctor, and then you get a snack, and then you can ride in the elevator, it wasn't enough. So the visual is really important, can be. Always carry a notebook and pen. Using visuals, if you walk away with one thing, visuals are really great. And the benefit here too, abstract is difficult. So visuals help provide concrete examples of what we're talking about. So if you're talking about bears, you can have a picture of a bear. Here's some hallway rules using PECs. Speech therapists can generally always create these. Boardmaker is a program that you can use to make these. It's fairly expensive, but they used to do free samples or like a free demo for a couple of weeks that will allow you to get kind of the basic PECs. Pinterest is a great source too, and other families are a great resource for those. But any way that you can make whatever you're trying to teach concrete, familiar, with visuals, it's going to help. A great example of this, how am I doing on time? I should watch that, shouldn't I? Oh, geez, we're almost an hour. That's okay. A great example of this, we do a program with Belmont called Music and Fun, and those are for students at Belmont who are taking a class in exceptional in learners. So they're going to be teachers one day. They might be music teachers. They're not necessarily special ed teachers. They can be any kind of teacher. And they create a curriculum each semester, and they get the benefit of training from the Down Syndrome Association, but also the benefit of each of the classes that have come before them and what they have done. So the class is tasked each semester with creating 2 hours worth of activities that the children with Down syndrome and typical peers will do. And then when they get there, they're assigned, each child with Down syndrome is assigned a buddy or one of the students from Belmont. And so we give them some basics and a lot of this kind of stuff. But it's very different when you try and you have to apply that to your own real world on the spot. So one of the first times we did this, there was a music major, and they decided they were going to sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And they were going to put all the children in a circle, and he was going to play it on the guitar. So there's the musical component. So we got that part right. There's the visual because he's actually playing an instrument in front of them. But they wanted to do Twinkle Twinkle Little Star like 10 different times. First, they were going to do it normal, and then they were going to do it happy, and then they were going to do it sad, and then they were going to sing it surprised, and then they were going to sing it scary, all while the children are just sitting. So those of you who are parents of children, you can kind of imagine how this went. They sang Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Everybody's into it for one round. The second time, they tried to sing it with a different emotion. 2 kids get up and leave the circle. The third time, I think 3 more kids got up. I mean, we never made it through 5. I know that. And I said, wait a minute, let's try this again. And we had a box of Beanie Babies. And I said, do you know Old MacDonald had a farm? Okay. They know Old MacDonald had a farm. It's the same kind of knowledge base as Twinkle Twinkle. Everybody knows these 2 songs. They're both equally as musical and boring all at the same time. And I said, so here's the difference, okay? Every kid gets to pick a Beanie Baby, and one at a time, we're going to make them stand in the middle, and you're going to sing about that song. They sang Old MacDonald. Not only did every child and every animal sing Old MacDonald for everybody that was there, so at least 12 times. They did it a second time. The kids thought this was so engaging. The only difference is the addition of the visual with the animal, and then having them be physically involved, one person at a time in the middle to add that self-confidence piece to it. So it's a great example of how impactful a simple visual can be. And again, adding a visual is oftentimes very, very simple. So great visuals are schedules and checklists. My only warning is if you're creating a visual schedule or a checklist, always have a plan to fade. And this should be in your mindset, no matter what support you put behind an individual. And I don't care if you're supporting your husband or your parents or whatever, whoever it is, you always want to have in mind how you're going to fade that support so that that person becomes independent in that skill, right? And if you put a Band-Aid on, you don't plan for the Band-Aid to stay there to help your leg, the cut heal. You don't plan for it to stay there for all eternity. It's there to support it until it's healed, and then there's no more Band-Aid. So it's the same concept with any support. Hopefully, in time, you can pull that support, use it less frequently maybe, or fewer words. Maybe you go from pictures to words. Maybe eventually you could just do verbal, or you can just point for the prompt. Whatever it is, whatever support you put in place, you always need to have a plan to pull that back to the extent that you can. And if you pull it back too soon and you have struggles, you have behaviors, you have running, you have drop and plopping. We've all seen our kids do these kinds of things. Put that support right back in. You took it out too soon in that case. And then try to slowly pull it out again. You know, if you have a vision problem, totally different ballgame. You keep the glasses on, you don't take them off. But when you're talking about other supports and helping our kids really reach their potential and independence, you want to keep them, keep a plan that's going to keep them independent. Remember, helping them to help themselves. Okay. There's the obligatory wiener dog slide because I have wiener dogs and I'm a wiener dog fan. But breaking it up, I think somebody posted recently about how do I keep my child focused. There's so many learning things that I'm trying to accomplish. I'm going to tell you that a big key is breaking it up. If you think about not just the learning styles, but the other types of things that influence one's ability to gain information, retain information, actually learn from it. And you think about individuals with Down syndrome, there's all kinds of medical things that play into that. Sleep apnea, if they have or have not slept well, that'll play into their ability to focus and pay attention and to remember things. Even physical abilities, muscle tone. If they have celiac, all different kinds. If they have heart issues, they may not be able to have the same stamina as another child. So learning to play tennis might be more difficult. And I'm just throwing out different examples, but there's lots of things that play into how well they'll be able to learn something. But I can tell you that giving them frequent breaks is likely to help your success. And the key here is to make sure and take a break before they get frustrated. Okay. And you know, if you have little kids, you're going to start out that period that you're making them work for you, whatever your educational activity is. If you're matching letters, You're going to have them do that for a short period of time, and you may judge, you may know after a short period of time that they will write the letter A 10 times, and then they're throwing the crayons everywhere, right? Because they're done. I don't want to do anymore. So what you do is the next time you have them, you only have them write 5, or you have them write 6, and then you put it away and say, great job. You're rewarding the positive behavior. You don't even have to mention the negative because you've cut that out of the equation altogether, right? Because you stopped before they got frustrated. So figure out what that tolerance level is. Maybe it's writing 5 out of 10, so you only have them write 5. And what happens is over time, you move it to 6. See if they can make it to 6. If they make it to 6, that's great. Then you can go to 7 and 8 and 10. It's the same thing like we're doing with the CPAP mask, right? So I tell him to put it on. He has to wear it for 2 minutes because I know he'll do that without ripping it off. So he does it for 2 minutes. It's all positive experience. It's great. He's getting the reward for that. I take it off after 2 minutes, and 5 minutes later, we practice again for 2 minutes. And over time, I'm going to build that from 2 minutes to 4 minutes to 8 minutes, and eventually overnight. But again, giving those breaks before they get frustrated will help you a lot. Breaking larger tasks down into much smaller, more easily attainable chunks will be important. And just look at what all you've asked them to do. One of the common worksheets my kids would come home from school with is, you've got all these math problems like 2 minus 2 and 4 minus 3, whatever. And then depending on what the answer of each of those are, then you color in the picture. So all the ones where the answer is 3 get to be red, and the answer is 4, make those yellow. That's a lot on one page. Think about how you can modify that to be very simple. If your child looks at that and says, I ain't gonna do that, you could take some of those math problems and just focus on some of those math problems. And then you could have a much simpler picture that said, you have 3 blocks and you do the coloring separate. I'm not saying you need to do that with that particular type of worksheet, but that's one example of taking something that has multiple tasks or a couple of tasks, breaking it down into smaller chunks. Whether it's different tasks that you're taking out and you're removing and chunking those, or you're taking that list of 25 letters or 25 math problems and you're going to do 5 at a time. If you know they can get through 5 without getting frustrated, do 5 at a time, and then work up from there. Again, you'll avoid some of those problem behaviors and frustration on your end. Make tasks shorter, less complicated. That's always going to work. And I like to use the Oreo method. Most people use that for communication, but I always say the first problem has to be really easy and the last problem has to be really easy. So whatever it is that you're trying to teach, if you're looking at those words, I want to do dog, then elephant, then cat, right? Because I want the first one, yay, and I might actually, depending on where my child is in this tolerance thing, and how long they can sit still, I might have to do 4 or 5 words that I know they already know before I bring in that more complicated one. But over time, we hope that that can be less and less. I'd like to go to the beach with this wiener dog, by the way. Really what's going to be key is to practice, practice, practice. You're going to get more generalization. They're going to build confidence. Again, the Oreo method works great for that because you're still going to practice the ones that you already know. And always look for any kind of accommodation or modification to give extra time and lots more opportunities for practice. Our kids need lots of practice to retain information. So you want to make sure that they get as much opportunity for that as possible. And of course, an accommodation doesn't change what's actually expected. It's just an assistance. So glasses are an example. If you're asking 2 children to read something and one needs glasses, that's simply an accommodation that you've allowed. A modification would be that you allowed the other child to hear it and not have to read it, where you're actually changing what's requested. Big time, reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. Best advice, reinforce the appropriate behavior, the appropriate response, the good work, whatever it is that you want to see more of, praise all that you can. Know what is most rewarding to the child. And in some cases, this is first you do this and then you get buzz. It's not always going to be the same thing. And the tasks that are more difficult to learn, potty training, for example, we use the iPad for that because nothing had that kind of meaning to my child is the iPad. And so he would do almost anything for an iPad at that particular time. There was no toy that I could substitute. You got to find out what it is that's going to motivate them. And it doesn't have to be an iPad or a specific toy. It could just be a high five. It could be time with brother or sister or whatever it might be. But figure that out. That's an important part of planning ahead. And I will say to limit specific reinforcements to specific behaviors or activities. This is kind of one of those ABA things where when we did potty training, he only got the iPad when he went to the bathroom. And we continued that for quite a period after that. But you know, if you're working on something at school, like staying in line, and if I stay in line, I get an M&M. I'm not encouraging food, but if M&M's my thing, we'll just use that for an example. You don't also want to give an M&M when he finishes his math necessarily, because then it gets satiated and they start to lose the effectiveness. So if you have, you know, something very specific, you probably want to change which reinforcements you're using if you're using tangible type things. Okay, so that's a lot of information. I think I went over my hour. I hope that's okay. What questions do you guys have? Just let me know. You can always send information or questions to me at the Down Syndrome Association, and if I don't have the answer, I'll find out who the most knowledgeable person is, and I will get you the expert answer that you need. So let me know what troubles you guys are having, particularly if you're schooling kids at home. I know it's hard, or educators, any way that we can help. Tanya, have you got any questions?
We haven't had any pop-up so far that I can see.
Well, I did not talk slowly and give everybody at least 10 seconds to process everything I was talking about. I apologize for having a little much caffeine. So if there are no other questions, we can wait a minute just to see if anybody has any questions.
Someone did ask, are we going to make the slides available to attendees?
Sure.
Okay, then I can email those out to everyone who participated. You'll also get a recording of this. Cynthia Matlock asked about using sight words or phonics.
So most of the, that's kind of a whole nother ball of wax, but most of the research that I have seen on reading for children with Down syndrome is that they're really going to need a combination of both. So of course, history changes all the time. I'm hearing an echo on my own voice. So it's throwing me off a little bit. I apologize. But there was a time period when for children with Down syndrome, it was just sight words. It was just get them to memorize all these words. And then there's been a lot, as more and more research happens, which finally it actually is happening. It's showing that our kids can decode as well. So, you know, they're going to need both. Most often, just like with typically developing kids, you start with, you know, the sight words. But we did letters in the, you know, in the bathtub, and we would say A or ah, you know, and this is B or buh. And so we kind of tried to do both at the same time, but my son is 11, and decoding is still very difficult for him. So it's something I think that will be a much longer process, but I encourage you to pursue both.
Okay, and then we have Kristen Lewis. She said, need more help with visual educational materials. Do you have websites for learning materials for visually impaired? My daughter has eyesight problems, and her doctor said she reads like it is running on a treadmill and needs enlarged material, especially for homeschooling.
Catherine, can you send me an email and I will see what's available? I have some resources. I don't have any just off the top of my head or sitting on my desktop here, but if you will send me an email, I'd be happy to get some together for you. It's so hard not to see you guys. Is there anything else?
Not seeing any more questions pop up. If you have any other questions that you're still typing, you should have a hand raise feature. If you will, please do that so that I know that you're working on a question. Otherwise, we'll wrap up.
Well, I certainly hope this is helpful to everyone as I interrupt your 10 extra seconds of processing time. I just encourage you to think about all of the strengths and how you can leverage those and be aware of the weaknesses so that you can support them and helping them to really help themselves and gain as much independence as they can. But we're here for you, for our families. If there's anything we can do, don't hesitate to reach out to myself. My contact information is there, or Tanya, or Tammy, or Aaron, if there's anything we can do for you guys. I think that's it.
All right, I would like to ask, when you all conclude this webinar, there will be a survey. If you don't mind completing that, we would greatly appreciate it. In addition, if you signed up before yesterday, we have added some webinars from Dr. George Capone and a futures planning webinar. And then later this week, we will be adding one from Paula Kluth and hopefully Dr. Scott Coe. So keep in mind, if you used a coupon code to register, those coupon codes are still good for future webinars.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much.